So welcome once again to our RMI research seminar with Eva van der Zee and Leona Henry. Our topic is how do changes in legislation influence organizing voluntary sustainability initiatives. And I will now hand over to our speakers for their presentation, sharing the screen via Zoom and with Q&A afterwards, of course.
Okay, great. Thank you, Guido, for this very nice introduction, and apologies also from my side for the technical hiccups that we are experiencing here. We'll talk fast to make up for that, so we have enough room for discussion. Now, as Guido already introduced, we're interested in this project in understanding what happens to multi-stakeholder initiatives when mandatory legislation comes in, and we'll give a little bit of context to that first before we actually kick off. So, sorry. Multi-stakeholder initiatives, I'm pretty sure most of you are, at least I know in the online audience, there's even some experts working on that, so most of you will be familiar with that in one way or the other. But if not, multi-stakeholder initiatives are organizing initiatives that try to develop sustainability standards for companies that actually want to become, let's say, more responsible in their activities along value chains, right? As many of you will know, business activities nowadays are globalized across many different, let's say, or involve many different value chain activities, and as such, unfortunately, also suspect to violations of sustainability issues such as human rights, but also environmental issues. Now, these standards that are developed by these multi-stakeholder initiatives, they are actually meant to help companies that want to become more accountable in their value chains to do so. And they do so in a voluntary manner. So companies are in no way obliged or forced to join MSIs. It is a voluntary exercise for those who are usually a little bit more, let's say, motivated to steer their value chain activities and become more responsible. Now, what is special about MSIs, besides this, let's say, voluntary structure that they have, is actually that they ideally allow for a lot of different stakeholders to be involved in this process of formulating the standards. So what does that mean? If we, for example, take a look at the coffee industry or a standard in the coffee industry, it would not be the case that just a few large coffee retailers develop the standard and then use it, but that also coffee farmers, NGOs, other suppliers down the value chain are really actively involved in this process and have a say in what that standard looks like. And basically, because of this, let's say, quite unique structure these standards have, and they're, let's say, again, ideally the fact that they allow for knowledge sharing across sectors and also cross-sectoral learning, they have become quite popular forms of organizing for more accountability and responsibility in global value chains. So as you see also here on the slide, often described something like the new regulators for global CSR activities. So they've become really important forms of organizing in the past, let's say, decades. And the one maybe important thing that I forgot to mention here, once companies join MSIs and successfully, let's say, with these standards, they will receive a certification, which I'm pretty sure many of you know. So, for example, the fair trade standards, the fair trade label, or the FSC label, also the Fair Labor Association. Those are some pretty well-known sustainability standards. Now, while it is the case that they are quite prominent in a lot of sectors, what we are recently also seeing is this trend in mandatory regulation developed by governments. And actually for that, I'm going to hand over to Eva, who's much more experienced in this, who will explain a little bit where this comes from.
Yeah, thank you, Leona. So one very important question, of course, that's been in our minds for a long time is who is responsible for human rights violations or environmental risks. So as you see here also on the map, often a corporation might be situated in a Western country, but it might operate all over the world due to globalization, and therefore it may harm human rights in countries where human rights are not necessarily enforced. So the question that has for long been at the mind of a lot of people, what has been discussed a lot is, okay, so should the companies themselves be responsible for human rights violations, or should the governments be responsible to ensure that companies do not violate human rights? And because this was such a back and forth, in 2011, we finally had the UN Guiding Principles on Businesses and Human Rights, which were later also incorporated in the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, also in 2011. These are very important legal instruments that are not legally binding, but a lot of countries have signed these guidelines, saying that they subscribe to them. So they are very important in that respect, also because they are the first that set these kind of global guidelines on how businesses should behave. But it doesn't leave it only to businesses. So you can see here, there are three very important pillars to these guidelines. It's also known as the Protect, Respect, and Remedy framework. So the first one is the Protect pillar. So that means that governments have a duty to protect human rights. So for example, in Germany, you probably will not see child labor because that's prohibited and also very effectively enforced. But this is very much a governmental obligation. Then there is a corporate responsibility to respect human rights. So this is more that companies have a kind of responsibility to make sure that no human rights are violated in their supply chain. So if they, for example, do businesses in Bangladesh where there might be a weaker government, they have to make sure that human rights are not violated there. And finally, the remedy means that there should be access to remedy for victims of business-related abuses. This is both the responsibility of the government as of the businesses. So governments, for example, have to have a very functional legal system. So if something happens, you can go to court and you can get damages, for example. Or businesses also have to have remedies in place when they violate human rights. So these are guidelines, they're not binding, but they kind of set the international guidelines that what we expect, what kind of behavior we expect from businesses and governments. And especially human rights due diligence is an important concept that came from the UN Guiding Principles. And I want to dive into that a little bit more because it means that a company needs to identify and also assess human rights impact. I also added here environmental risk because increasingly there is this idea that climate change is very much a part of human rights, and if climate change is not addressed, that might also violate human rights. So human rights due diligence is now often considered a little bit broader than simply only human rights, like labor laws, but can also include environmental risks. Okay, so, but this company has to identify and assess these impacts. They have to integrate these findings that they get from their impact assessment. They have to implement that across their company processes. And also they have then to track the effectiveness of these measures and communicate how impacts are being addressed. Until now, that has mostly been voluntary. So most of the multi-stakeholder initiatives that Leona talked about, they have some rules in place that try to promote this kind of due diligence amongst companies. But what we see, and here's this one study, there are more studies that are even more negative. We see that businesses do not really incorporate a full due diligence within their processes. So this is a study by the European Commission in 2020, where you can see that only 43% of the business respondents indicated that they conduct a full due diligence, but the others do not. And of course, this is based on their responses. There are more elaborate studies that show that we are in even a worse situation than this would indicate. So yeah, a lot of countries feel like something needs to be done, and especially in the European Union, we see a lot of civil society action and political processes, but also already adopted laws that mandate due diligence in the companies that are situated in their country itself. And the idea behind this, as I already said, with if a company does business in Bangladesh, just to have an example, and they engage in labor rights, it might well be that Bangladesh has difficulty to enforce labor rights in Bangladesh, and therefore you might argue that the Netherlands or Germany or France try to mandate their multinationals and their corporations to take due diligence into account throughout their whole supply chain, so also then in Bangladesh. So we don't need Bangladesh anymore to enforce these often very difficult due diligence obligations, because they're often, many multinationals have a much bigger annual return than many weak states. So, but we have to talk about this a bit more. So this is a bit of a maybe confusing table, but I tried to put down a few of the mandatory due diligence legislation that exists currently in France and Germany. And there is a proposal in the Netherlands and also a proposal by European Parliament that the European Commission is working on. So here you can see that it's very different between countries what kind of due diligence requirements they have. So, for example, in France, there should be 5,000 employees in France or more than 10,000 employees in France or abroad. And in Germany, this will in 2024 be only for those companies that are bigger than 1,000 employees. And in the Netherlands, there are other requirements. So this is very confusing. That's also why the European Parliament wants to have one single legislation in the whole of Europe so that it's not so confusing for companies. But what you also see is that the scope differs quite a bit between the legislation that we see now. So in Germany, it's only the first tier, but the European Parliament emphasized, okay, those tiers that may pose major risks should be included. And of course, if you only have to take your due diligence within Germany, that's much easier than if you have to go through your whole supply chain. So in France and the Netherlands, they're quite a little clear on this. And a very important difference between multi-stakeholder initiatives is that legislation focuses very much on sanctions. In a multi-stakeholder initiative, often focus on rewards, so you can get a certification label if you comply with their requirements, but with legislation, you get a fine. And these are generally not so high. The European Parliament wants to have a little bit higher fine. I'm not sure if that will actually be put in place. And what we see in France, it's still not clear because the damages may mostly be rewarded by the courts, so we have to await court decisions. But in Germany, for example, it's only 2% of average turnover. You can have also 3 years exclusion of public sector contracts. So these are a bit of the sanctions that you might have. Yeah, so unique in the Netherlands is that if a company does not comply with the due diligence requirements, then the CEO can have at least 6 years in prison, up to 6 years imprisonment if they violate the mandatory due diligence 3 times in a row. Yeah, I don't want to dive into that a little bit more, but there's also a lot of the way they try to enforce it is mainly through legislation. So then NGOs and other stakeholders can go to court saying that their due diligence has been violated. But yeah, this is a little bit of the overview. I want to give it back to Leona.
Okay, exactly. So now we have a little bit more of context. We're gonna return back to, let's say, what is our main, let's say, research problem coming from this whole situation. So what is happening? On the one hand, we see MSIs that have been around for quite a few years already, and that successfully or are, let's say, popular governance mechanisms in a lot of sectors. And what's happening now, actually, as Eva just explained, while there might be differences in legislation and while these laws formulated by different countries might look slightly, might differ on certain aspects, nevertheless, they do all, let's say, enter the regulatory arena of what MSIs have been doing so far, right? And that creates a situation where we have multiple and also partly overlapping regulatory instruments that ensure companies' due diligence. We can also call that accountability, but let's stick with due diligence along the value chain. And this problem of multiple instruments or regulatory tools prevailing in a particular sector, we're trying to understand through the theoretical lens and the literature on standard multiplicity. Now, standard multiplicity is actually describing a situation, as I already announced, in which multiple and oftentimes seemingly similar standards try to regulate a particular commodity or a particular value chain in a certain sector. Now, if you look at an example, if you would go to the supermarket and you would turn around 10 chocolate bars, you'll probably find 10 different labels signaling to you that this is a sustainable product, right? So each of these labels wants to regulate basically sustainability along the value chain, due diligence, but does so maybe in a slightly different manner. So we're looking at a situation in which, let's say, in various commodities, a lot of different labels are starting to coexist. And this multiplicity, so the situation of multiplicity, we can debate whether it has, let's say, mostly positive or negative effects from a regulatory perspective. There's different opinions on that. But what is for sure is actually that for the MSIs operating in such sectors, so who develop a standard, for example, in the chocolate or the cocoa industry, these MSIs need to somehow show that they are different vis-a-vis other standards, right? So they need to somehow prove their relevance versus the other standards that are around. And what we see is that MSIs actually do so by, for example, focusing on particular, let's say, issues within the value chain that are not yet covered by other standards. I think a very, let's say, a very clear example here is the coffee industry, which is also an industry that's characterized by a lot of different sustainability standards, right? We all know, for example, what I just showed, fair trade, but then there's also the Rainforest Alliance, UTZ, just to name a few. And what these standards have actually been doing is that they all, let's say, try to regulate value chains in the coffee industry, they all focus somehow on a little bit of a different issue within that industry, right? So fair trade focused on fair wages for coffee farmers, whereas, for example, the Rainforest Alliance, which is another big MSI, focuses much more on environmental aspects of the coffee value chain. So we see that MSIs actually try to sort of coexist in situations of multiplicity and sort of try to position themselves in a way that they stay relevant. So that actually has been working for quite some sectors for a few years. But what we actually see now with this mandatory regulation, let's say, coming up, is that we, or not we, but MSIs face a little bit of a different relevance problem. Because it is, first of all, also for MSIs necessary that they are, let's say, that they are adhering to the law, right? So they also operate in legal frameworks. So that means their standards have to also, in a way, comply with these mandatory regulations that Eva just explained. So they can't just deviate from that to be different in a way. They really have to also, adjust their policies to that. Secondly, what also is a danger, of course, for MSIs and their standards is that once companies already have to comply with a legal requirement, so with a mandatory due diligence law, which means administrative burden and which means time and effort, they might opt out of MSIs because they feel like it's already enough to comply with just the law, right? So compliance with the law means, is the label still necessary? Do we still need to join this MSI? So in a way, this multiplicity problem, it shifts a little bit due to the, let's say, combination of legislation on the one hand and voluntary initiatives on the other hand, which leaves us with the question how MSIs are actually influenced by this new regulatory trend and how they actually adapt to it. And this is actually what we're trying to find out. And I will just briefly take you through our method section here before we show you some of our preliminary findings. So what we're doing here to answer this question is a qualitative study. So we're building on a qualitative design in which we are currently interviewing, Eva and I, various actors in MSIs that are, let's say, the actors in these MSIs are involved in the standard setting process of these MSIs, and we're talking to different ones across commodities, but which all have, let's say, human and environmental issues in their sustainability standard, right? So they all are, let's say, confronted, or at least they will experience some impact of the laws that are being formulated right now. And yeah, let's say based on our, or building on our inductively inspired design, we're already looking at data analysis, or already in the midst of data analysis along with our data collection, and we're doing that in what many of you will know as the JOIA methodology, so a three-step process where we're slowly coming to more, let's say, theoretical constructs. And as I mentioned, we're still very much in the midst of our analysis. So this, what we're going to show you now, are not, let's say, our final findings, but nevertheless, we think we have some interesting things to highlight already, which we're going to go into now. Unless there's, of course, maybe from the audience any questions for clarification that we need to go through now. Okay. So what have we basically been hearing so far from MSIs and let's say the actors involved in MSIs surrounding this problem of multiple, first of all, the trend of legislation coming in and then having to, let's say, safeguard their relevance. So first of all, and this was, I think it was less surprising to you, Eva, than to me, but most of the actors we talked to mentioned that they actually don't really see the laws as a threat to their existence all too much. On the contrary, some of them have even indicated that because of this looming legislation, a lot of companies have sort of started to become more interested in joining MSIs because they feel like it might be sort of a first step to actually understanding and complying with the law eventually. So some MSIs have actually said that, well, for us, as this quote shows, it helped us to build a stronger case for companies to join us because they realize now they are waking up and have to become serious, and they're realizing now that something has to be done, and feel like maybe joining MSIs might be a first step to a solution. Nevertheless, at the same time, we also see how MSIs indicate that they do not find this situation very, let's say, easy to live with. And the most prominent reason for that is actually captured by the quote you see here, which says it will be very difficult for us to adapt standards in such a way that they are general enough to follow legislation, but that traders can still comply with them. What that basically means is that a lot of MSIs are fearing that because the law is so general and not maybe, let's say, targeted to their niche standards, as I just explained, a lot of MSIs have developed standards that maybe just focus on one aspect, so maybe more on human rights or maybe more on environmental issues. So they sort of feel like they have to become more general and therefore lose their attractiveness to maybe the particular traders they work with. Please interrupt or feel free at any time if you want to add. Yeah. So on the one hand, we see that they're welcoming this the situation in principle, but also that they clearly see challenges in how to further develop their own standards in this situation, basically. Now, what we also see is that MSIs are clearly indicating that in the future they perceive that they will be playing a different role. So they're sort of thinking about how, given the fact that legislation will become stronger, how will we actually position ourselves, and what will we be? Will we be the standard setters in the future? Will we, let's say, simply keep acting as the MSIs as we have done so far? And most of them are actually saying, well, we believe our role is, and I'm not going to read the entire quote here, but our role will be much more concrete and much more specific. So we actually see ourselves helping companies in the future also understanding the law and becoming, let's say, even better at it, or even going beyond it. So for companies that are truly interested in creating strong due diligence across along their value chain, we can make them actually go a little bit beyond what this very general law says to helping them understand how they can even become better. So they are not maybe so much the first as it is not a first option for regulation. It would become a complementary option for regulation that helps companies that want to become even more, want to go a little bit beyond just complying with the law, to put it simply, to become even better at understanding their supply chains. And this is just one example, actually, of a quote, of course, but this idea of where will we be, let's say, in the regulatory landscape in the future, if I can summarize it like this is something that we see a lot. So MSIs actually having to rethink maybe their position in that overall field. And then finally, one thing that we also wanted to highlight, which we think is quite interesting, which is also related to our last point, but that MSIs are starting to develop, let's say, new services based on this situation. So they're not just producing the standard anymore, if we can say it like this, just producing, but they're actually thinking about what sort of services can they offer for companies that are, let's say, different from that, but which on the one hand help companies understand the complexity of the situation, but which also help MSIs, let's say, safeguard their relevance. So as this quote, for example, shows, some MSIs have started to offer very elaborate human rights assessments or value chain assessments to companies in order to, let's say, give them something on top of maybe the standard that they have been offering so far, and to help them, as I said, on the one hand, understand the legal situation and the changes in that better, but on the other also make sure that companies don't opt out of the standard, lose interest, and basically just comply with the law.
May I add something?
Sure, yeah. Go for
What
it.
I thought was very interesting with this within this context is that a lot of MSIs said that they're developing tools to make it easier for companies to write down how they did their due diligence, or how they can make sure communicate to others, be transparent that they actually took their due diligence, and that they're actually competing on creating the most user-friendly or most effective tool to do this. And I thought that was interesting that there is now a new market.
Yeah, so indeed, so this we see basically, even though we're still in the midst of what we're trying to find out, we're clearly seeing that MSIs are somehow rethinking their position in this landscape, and also thinking about what else can we do besides just offering the sustainability standard that we've been offering so far. So that will be very interesting to see where they are actually taking this. All right, do you want to go for this one?
You can do the record.
Sure. Okay. Yeah. So again, still an ongoing project, but where do we see this going in terms of, let's say, the theoretical contributions from our study? Well, first of all, what we believe is a very interesting contribution is that the fact that our study shows how MSIs, let's say, adapt to a new type of multiplicity, right? So as I said earlier, there is a, let's say, quite, well, I wouldn't say super large, but there is a literature on standard multiplicity that has also been developing in the past years. But so far, this literature has mostly focused on standard multiplicity when this is caused by multiple different MSIs, right? So what do MSIs do when they are confronted with more and more voluntary initiatives, but hasn't looked so much at the dynamics that unfold when actually governmental legislation kicks in. And we think this is a really interesting theoretical avenue that we're taking here. And then also, of course, we're keen to find out how the emergence of hard law influences also the capacity of MSIs or soft law mechanisms to actually regulate corporate sustainability. So if we look at it from a, let's say, more meta perspective, how can we regulate CSR behavior? Then this will be a very interesting also angle to take. And then finally, and this is really also much more of your let's say expertise, it provides hopefully more insights in how these two regulatory instruments can be, let's say, combined in an effective manner. So I think you might come back to this in our practical implications. So this one is a little bit on the verge of practical and theoretical, but the smart mix, right? So
Yeah, and so what I would be great, or what we were interested, but especially from a legal point of view, I would be very interested to see how can these multi-stakeholder initiatives and mandatory due diligence legislation complement each other. I'm just going to go back to this graph. So here you see that 43% of businesses actually already engage in full due diligence. So there is apparently some effectiveness of multi-stakeholder initiatives. And we know from the behavioral literature, behavioral economics mostly, that sanctions may have a very different effect on behavior than, for example, than rewards that are offered by multi-stakeholder initiatives. So it might well be if we would say, okay, let's only go for mandatory due diligence legislation because law is the best and only with law we can do everything. I think we are underestimating the force and the power of multi-stakeholder initiatives and voluntary initiatives. So I think they can actually very much complement each other, and we see that especially in the environmental law literature, this concept of smart mixes, that you have voluntary, mandatory requirements that actually complement each other in a way to be even more effective than what they could ever achieve alone. So I think our study can have some thoughts on that.
Yeah. Super, thank you. Yeah, and with that, we're actually basically at the end of our presentation. Thank you so much for joining online and for being here. And we look forward to questions, feedback, anything that, again, we're still in the midst of the project, so anything that can help us is very much welcome.
Yes. Thank you so much, Leona, for the presentation, and I'm sure we'll have lots of questions now for online and here in the room. There was one in the chat, somebody asked, sorry, I can just see who it was, what was the research question again? So this was not a critical comment, just a reminder, if you can just put it up once again.
Yeah.
So how are MSIs influenced by and how do they adapt to multiplicity around the due diligence regulation? I have, of course, questions myself and comments, but I will hold back and I would invite the online audience, and Julia has already got the first hand up, that's wonderful. So we'll start with online, Julia, in a moment, Julia, and then, of course, the second question will come from somebody here in the room, and Simone is already ready. So
should we stop
the screen sharing, please? That would be great. And Julia, we can see you actually on the big screen, as you can see now behind.
I don't see it. Fantastic. Thank you so much, and thanks for repeating the research question. Very interesting presentation. Thanks both for that. I was wondering, in respect to your question, which is really broad, how, I mean, I would say the easy answer is that it's very different between industries and company sizes and such, right? Because you said you speak to garment. Do you hear me? Just because you look.
Yeah, I can hear you, yes.
Because obviously the influence that a law might have on initiatives in the cocoa industry or on or differently in the garment industry is very, very different, given the difference in supply chain structure and also company size and capacities and such. I mean, in the cocoa industry, you have a few big players that have loads of knowledge and capacity to do so. But then in the garment industry, as I don't know if you know, but I've studied, for example, the textiles partnership since 2016. And it was very interesting that a few front runners, but a few small companies like Hess Natur also actually left the German textiles partnership because they simply didn't have the capacities anymore to live up to what they required and requested in the initiative. And they sort of then relied on a state law to potentially come up, whereas bigger companies or also laggards like Kick or Primark had the capacity to continue with things like that. So I think like how the law influences initiatives or what this means for how companies react to it is really, really different given the size of the companies, their purpose, but then also the complexity of the sector, because there are some sectors that I highly doubt that you can regulate the different issues in the different steps. You have some sectors where you have 140 supply chain steps, So you need to rely on initiatives to tackle different steps and issues within these steps. So I wonder how you account for in your study the differences between sectors, organizations, purposes, and things like that.
Yeah. Should I? Yeah. So thanks, Julia, for this question. I was already expecting a very good question from your side on this topic, of course. And you're completely right in saying that these value chains and also the MSIs as regulator have very different components and different structures. And yeah, these differences should somehow be taken into account. Well, this is something that we realized. For now, we've actually said that in this first, let's say, in this first study that is really exploratory of nature, we're focusing more on, let's say, MSIs as a form of organizing without so much looking at these explicit differences, and really interested in trying to detect, let's say, more aggregate patterns that we see across MSIs, regardless of the commodity they try to regulate or the, let's say, the product they try to certify, right? So for this, so let's say for this first study, we're really more interested in looking at these broader, let's say, patterns. But obviously, we also realize that that is one of the differences that these differences might actually be very influential. And I think we're already looking at maybe a second project here. But for this first one, we're not so much focused on finding, let's say, different patterns or differences between MSIs, but are more interested in what happens to MSIs generally. So MSIs that, of course, have differences, but that also have a lot of similarities in how they set up their standards, right? So we are not taking into account standards that just focus very much, for example, only on environmental issues, because we know that they will not be affected so much by a mandatory due diligence legislation, right? So we're on the one hand, we can say we're not, let's say, explicitly taking these differences into account yet in the study, but we're also aware of them, and we're our sample is set up in such a way that they're actually not also just random MSIs, right? So this would be my take on it, and of course we have discussed that, right? Eva, do you want to add more to this?
I think it's very interesting from a legal point of view. I think it's very interesting question. Also, I think that's exactly the reason why I wasn't so surprised by our first finding, because I think there is still so much that MSIs can do and which mandatory legislation cannot. But this is part of the law part of this this question. But for the rest, I think Leona answered it.
Great, thank you very much. Simone.
Okay. Thank you. It's a great research. I was wondering, in particular with the last point you were interested in. So, what changing role do they see, or which kind of role do those MSIs see for themselves in the future, in case there's the legal registration coming? And I thought the kinds of services that you were talking about somehow reflected that they were expecting that their role or their own standard is less or will be less restrictive than the legal one. So because so you said that they're offering new services like assessing the value change with regard to the human rights or environmental sustainability aspects and so on, but on the other hand, I mean, what we see, for instance, in the fashion industry is that with the new Supply Chain Due Diligence Act is not that restrictive than many of the other standards that we have in that industry. So the Fair Foundation standard, for instance, is particularly strict when it comes to human rights, and less so this Supply Chain Due Diligence Act. So there can be, for those MSIs in the future, the standard setting MSIs, they can be in particular still be interesting for companies who want to position themselves as the real ethical ones or moral ones.
I fully agree. Yeah, that's what we also noticed in interviews, that MSIs see exactly that role, that they set more stringent requirements so that companies can show that they really take a further step beyond legislation. I think maybe what Leona was hinting at, but maybe you should, no, I don't know. So of course, if legislation is considered by the public as already enough, then they might not have this incentive that much anymore, that would happen. But these tools were not meant to indicate that multi-stakeholder initiatives feel like their standards would be lower than mandatory diligence. We didn't find that. They think they will set more stringent standards.
Yeah, but maybe to add to that, so they, of course, it will, what a lot of the, or what we've been hearing a lot is that in a way they might not have to make their standard as restrictive, but to make it a little bit more general, so to take it a little bit broader, because of course they also need to show how they fall within legal frameworks, right? So MSIs, even though they're often, let's say, they're voluntary and some of them are founded by NGOs, they still have to comply with the law, right? So they can't just set their own. So if the legal, let's say, framework, the broader legal framework changes, they will also in a way have to change their standard to show that they still fit in that framework, right? So they're not, that doesn't mean that they necessarily have to become less restrictive, but maybe they will have to be also a little bit more general to cover all those areas that the law also would cover. And yeah, I think what they've also said, that what a lot of MSIs are expecting is that really the industry front runners, that they will not, let's say, opt out of MSIs because it will be too much work, or it will, or they feel like the law is already enough, right? But they will actually try to do both and use MSIs as a way to learn even further and go beyond the law and beyond the legal requirements. So that is kind of the hope of many MSIs, what we've seen so far, that they actually, that there are still some companies,
so
do both.
Being more restrictive would be actually, shall I say, the unique selling proposition of those MSIs.
That could be, yeah.
I mean,
That's interesting.
To remain competitive or to remain attractive for companies.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Henrik, if it's okay, I'll ask Joe first, because he's online, and then next one on the list is Henrik Wilhelmi in the room. So Joe, thanks for raising your hand. Please
Can
go
you hear
ahead.
me okay?
Yeah, great.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm well outside of my area, but I feel like what I'm hearing you say is that it's kind of an interaction between the regulation and these MSIs might be kind of ideal, that there's like a floor being set by the regulation, with the MSIs kind of moving on to the next. Is there any coordination across them at all? Is the law that's being developed trying to carve out space for MSIs? Are MSIs just required to see what happens on the legal side and then try and address that? Is there any coordination there at all, or could there be, or should there be?
Should I move in?
I also, great question. Maybe you could add on. So we discussed with some MSIs that they are in stakeholder consultations also with, especially at the European Commission. There is some involvement. I don't know if that's also what you want to say.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think traditionally already MSIs really try to push also legislation and try to influence governmental regulations, right? So that's also one of their, I would say, besides standard setting, one of the things that they actually actively promote, so that they sort of also have an influence there. But the sorry, I was just distracted by a question coming up. But so what we see indeed, what Eva said is also that in this case, so with the mandatory due diligence legislation, a lot of MSIs also try to kind of use their experience to inform government on what this legislation should look like, right? And I'm actually not too sure to what extent what governments then, how much they actually do with it. That's something that maybe you know more about, but at least we know that MSIs try to influence that by sharing their experiences and and trying to make this legislation also as, let's say, effective as possible.
Yeah, there is also some common OECD guidelines on this topic that kind of try to stimulate stakeholder involvement with making new laws, but of course, how much governments actually take these insights then into account or engage in stakeholder involvement, that may differ quite a lot in every per case in the context.
Yeah, but it's definitely the case that there are efforts to make this a coordinated effort, right? So there is consultation between MSIs and governments in order to not to streamline regulation, but to make sure that the experiences MSIs gather in their work also translate into governmental legislation, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Julia. We've seen that you want to come back to the sector question in a moment, and we will. But now it's Henrik's turn.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interesting, fascinating presentation. I think this is a highly timely topic in any case. And my initial question also went for the direction of differences, of course, between MSIs, giving that strategy research that is somehow on the table. But understand that is not the core point of your research at that point in time. So I was wondering, do you think that there's a parallel in the development of international MSIs and what we see more on a national level? And I was particularly thinking of food standards and how they evolved, particularly with regards to organic food, for example, in Germany. So if you think about the regulation of what comes as organic food and how stakeholder initiatives positions themselves as the legal definition of organic food is progressing, that seems to be a very similar development in terms of what you observe on the international level. Do you see any parallels in there, or is that different trajectory?
Sure.
Yes.
I think there's maybe let's say a two-way answer to this, because first of all, if we look at, we're speaking to international MSIs mostly, or at least MSIs that are, let's say, open for also international, I don't want to say business, but that offer their standards to international audience, right? So that means that in terms of how it differs between national and international legislation, I'm not sure we even have any purely national MSIs in our, we don't actually have that. So we can't really say too much about it, but nevertheless, maybe to come back to this point of organic food and whether that's a similar development, we actually interestingly talked to one organic food or one MSI that produces food labels for the organic market, where we actually found out that this problem that we're seeing is actually not so much of a problem, because the organic companies already, I think he said that they already so much comply with, basically they already go so much beyond what the law would require that for them it's really not, on their minds, because they're saying, well, we've already been doing this for 10 years, so it doesn't really matter if the law comes, right? That's sort of what I picked up from that sector, at least, so from the organic food sector, which is very different from what we're seeing in other commodities, where it's harder for companies to actually really go beyond maybe what's already expected. But maybe you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully understand the question. Do you mean that the European organic label, for example, would that be an international? Would you consider that international organic standard, or?
Yeah, sure. So my question, I think maybe our question was not clearly stated. So I understand that you're focusing on international multi-stakeholder initiatives, and my question was whether the developments and the patterns that observe in how they respond to international legislation that obviously affects what they try to do, whether this development is similar to what we saw for more national multi-stakeholder initiatives, for example, in the organic food regulation and how they respond to that. And I was thinking about the Demeter standard, for example, in Germany, where those guys are clearly also pushing towards boundaries that are far beyond the national regulation of what comes as organic food in many ways. And they also act as consultants So that is also a pattern that you seem to observe on the international level. So my question was, is this something that basically follows along the same tracks? Because if that is the case, then if you look at the national level, you could see basically into the future of what we may see on the international level as well in terms of how this competitive dynamic will play out.
Yeah. Let this one take me for this. Think about it.
I'm having to elaborate on that.
Meanwhile, I would like to invite Matthias Horter to give a comment or ask a question, and maybe for the audience in general, ZNU next to your name, that is a private initiative, if I'm not mistaken. Please, yeah, it's your turn now. You're still on mute. Microphone.
Just a second. Okay, I have two switchers. So thank you very much. Yeah, Matthias Hauser, my name, from ZNU, since they're there since last February 2020. This is rather a comment than a question due to the point which came before. In terms of organic food, I think we have well-established standards on the national side in Germany and on the European side, at least visible by these labels, you know, the European flour and the German biosign. And recently we just had in Germany a launch of a new standard, although we have already ZNU standards since more than 10 years, but there's an organization which has driven this quite heavily. We Care is the name, and the companies who are certified according We Care, they are allowed to use this, let's say, company certification for sustainability. They are allowed to use that label on their products for organic food only. So this is a development we see, and the other thing is, I have to say that you probably know this, organic food by definition is not sustainable. There are a lot of examples around if you buy, but unfortunately a lot of consumers think so, that's, let's say, can be extrapolated to the entire supply chain. But as you know, if you take avocado, if you take bananas or whatever from somewhere which might be organic, it's not automatically that the entire supply chain is sustainable, not at all. So I think there at this point also kind of clarification is necessary, at least towards the consumer. And another comment is, I don't know whether you have this in your study, but we see now, due to the new German law, that for sure companies are somehow challenged as long as they have, for example, the ZNU certification. Yeah, so our company certification ZNU is offering since more than 10 years. We currently are on the way to, let's say, extend to modify the standard we have, or my colleagues have developed in the last years, and to even, let's say, boost, or let's say include more aspects in terms of supply chain, as it was described already, but we for sure take into account what the new law is covering now. On the other side, we see an MSI, which is from EcoVadis, probably the globally most known supply chain management tool and scoring system you have, although there are a couple of others. But we see that EcoVadis has the issue for sure as well to cover the new German law in a proper way. And on the third comment is that we are contacted by companies who have either the ZNU standard or EcoVadis, and now this is already one challenge they had since not since ever, but in the last years, and now there comes a regulation in place which even forces them to deliver against the regulation. So they are contacting us and asking, hey, do we have to decide between the MSI EcoVadis or ZNU? And we say, no, these are two systems who add good points to each other. By EcoVadis you have the very, very big focus on the supply chain, and by ZNU you have the entire company view. You have to make sure that in all aspects of sustainability you are delivering, and that the company management is done in a proper way. And these guys, for sure, we have to guide them somehow. Some are even asking us, or let's say our attached consultancy to help them fill out the MSI, let's say EcoVadis questionnaire. Yeah, because they're completely lost between regulation on one side, between and on the other side the requirements by MSIs like EcoVadis and others. Yeah. So these are just comments, let's say, but which might play a role in your study of your further future. I don't know, but this is what our perspective and the things we are challenged with or we are confronted with.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's very interesting. I mean, it's of course some of the points that you mentioned. For example, this confusion between, what do we fill out where and where do we kind of go now in terms of regulating among companies. That's also what we've been hearing in our interviews a lot, right? And actually, also one of the reasons why some MSIs are actually fearing that they might, let's say, lose their relevance because companies feel like it's all too much. So we're just going to do what is really, let's say, purely necessary, which then of course becomes the law and not an MSI. So in a way, this is a really valid point also for a study. And I think it's interesting to hear because our interviews so far, they have not been for, I think the standard is really actually one of these national initiatives, right, that Henry mentioned. So actually it would be interesting maybe to talk more. We won't do that now. Yeah. Do you want to add something?
Well, I actually also on the previous questions that I want to say something because I think, but maybe that's very much from a law perspective, but I would say the nature very much focuses on organic, and although you cannot sell your product as being organic if you don't comply with the national legislation or EU legislation on what organic is, you can still sell your product. And I think with the due diligence legislation, it's a little bit different because all companies, no matter what, they have to comply. So I don't know, maybe that would be a problem to put them on the equal footing. I have to talk more. So very interesting.
Yeah, thanks so much. I would like to slip in a question myself and also maybe look a little bit behind this overall process, as I also mentioned in the introduction, and really focus on the MSIs and their role. And we've had a number of scandals involving the MSIs. And so we can't see them necessarily as always the good guys, right? We can't see government always as the good guys, I know. But do you see that there's a problem, or that this recent development of introducing more legislation is because of some sort of disappointment by the MSIs? And we know how some of them are even accused of being just the tools for greenwashing, and if they are now struggling for their survival, it's maybe because they want to continue the lobbying for softer law. I mean, like Tim Bartley already said a long time ago that I think multinationals are getting involved in soft law so that the harder law doesn't come, changing the metaphor a little bit here. But how do you see that? And also in your interviews, do they give this impression that they are seen more negatively now, the MSI, that governments are actually working against them, whilst, as you indicated also at the end of your presentation, the government might actually be working with them if they were sure that they are on the same side? And while you could even think of like legalizing some of these labels and making them kind of part of the law, but that doesn't sound like it. So how about this general situation that in the recent years, the MSIs have had their own issues, their own scandals, and now maybe they are driven back, partly also because of that. Does that come out in your interviews at all? Or do you see that problem, and is it part of their reaction that they have, that they feel that they're being driven out?
I didn't really notice that I have some theoretical thoughts on the question, but from the interviews, I don't think.
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm guessing that even if they were, let's say, most people or most actors in the MSIs probably wouldn't admit that they, because of the scandals, they are becoming less relevant. I think that's maybe also something that they, even if they would think so, maybe wouldn't say out loud. But at the same time, I think this very much refers back to what you showed in the beginning, right? So this pie chart of how effective is voluntary due diligence, where we actually also see that it's not always that effective. Also because of the scandals these MSIs are associated with, and in turn that triggered mandatory due diligence to become even more stronger, right? And we also know from a lot of MSI literature indeed that MSIs are, even though they're popular, they're also not the holy grail of regulation. They also have a lot of loopholes and pitfalls, and indeed are associated also sometimes with ineffective regulation, which I can only imagine, let's say also looking at this chart you showed, reinforce the need for regulation, right? And I think what MSIs, what is clearly coming out of our interviews, at least, is not that they're seeing them so much, let's say, as, how do I say it, as them maybe being driven away because they are seen as the bad guys or having a negative reputation, but what they do clearly indicate is that they see themselves as complementary to the law in the sense that they really offer more. So they really also offer this platform for learning and for exchange. They really offer this very much more inclusive environment than a law could ever offer. So they do try to kind of profile themselves as not, let's say, the tools of legislation, or as you said, maybe a two-way, let's say, sort of synergy that combines both complying with the law and complying with an MSI, right? This is actually something that they're very, very afraid of happening. So they do really, what really comes out is that they do see themselves as a very different tool, and they want to keep it that way, right?
Okay.
So that would be my reaction to
Great.
it.
Yeah, it's a slightly different point, but I think it's in the background.
It is, yeah.
Now, Julia Grimm, thank you for your chat comments. Very well, very good. Not everybody in the room could see them, so would you like to bring up a couple of the points you raised there? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Very interesting conversation. I think my questions are all over the place, so I'll just leave them there and you can maybe have a look at it afterwards. Just like to summarize it, I guess, I think what you're studying is super interesting, and I know that there's a really, really big interest in the academic community to better understand this interplay and the influence of state law and MSIs, especially in the OMT community. However, given these questions that are, as said, like all over the place, I feel like maybe you have more on that already written down, or you're still in the beginning. So I guess I would try to be more clear on your sample and how you can actually take care of or control for all these differences between different sectors, different MSI types. For example, the influence that a national law may have on a national MSI is certainly completely different from a national law on an international MSI. But then again, like very different between industries where you, I don't know, take the automotive industries, they have drive sustainability. I don't know if you would consider this an MSI, but they would never give that up. Although now there is a Lieferkettengesetz in Germany, whereas the Textilbündnis is I don't think it's gonna survive the Lieferkettengesetz because it just served as a lobbying mechanism all along. So in case you're still in the beginning, I guess I would strongly encourage you to stick to somewhat comparable MSIs and law types. So for example, speak to, I don't know, look at the Textiles Partnership and the Lieferkettengesetz, and in France, the thingy and the law, and in the Netherlands, the covenant, how it's called, and the law, or be aware at least that people are gonna shoot random questions at you in the reviewing process. But overall, like honestly, applause. It's such a cool and very, very interesting topic, and I'm sure you will receive a lot of interest and positive attention on that study.
Yeah, thank you. That's nice to hear. And I think we have, of course, we were aware also of this, let's say, this question that is in our study, and we'll have to look at how we address that. But yeah, I think it's a really good point to also say that we can use, let's say, comparable comparable types of or comparable combinations of wild types and MSIs, right? That would be a really valuable approach. Thank you thanks for that. Yeah.
Thank you also from my side. Now here in the room, are there further questions or interest? One of the things I was considering was whether you need more data types, not just interviews. So what kind of, what could that be? Like, can you maybe collect actual changes in the MSI's internal regulations, and if they are actually changing things like their certification rules or membership or things like that, or what else could there be? Because as you said, indeed, maybe in the interviews you only get so far, and depending on what kind of questions you ask, they're going to tell you all kinds of things.
Yeah.
But can we actually get a feeling of how they respond by other means? Did you consider that?
We did think about the membership, if that increased when legislation was proposed, but
So if they lost members or one additional
yes.
members, yeah.
But in interviews they said they didn't win any more members, that didn't change anything. I was a bit surprised by that. You can imagine that they would win some more members with this, but yeah.
Yeah. And what about interviewing representatives of the legislation side? How they actually see the MSIs?
Yeah, so we have talked about that, but I think that would be very interesting. But how I understood it is also from Leona's side that it would be good to now focus first on the MSIs and then maybe in the subsequent project also talk to the regulators. But
yeah, but we're still, I mean, yeah, as you can feel, we're still very much in the middle of all of this and deciding on some of these questions still. And of course, thankful for these comments also because it helps us kind of decide on that a little bit more. Because indeed we will need to address questions like sector differences, also whether our interviews will be enough, whether we can see changes in a different way. What is a little bit tricky with these standards is that their revision processes only take place every 5 years. So we can't just look at what happens next year in the standard, and not all revision processes take place at the same time. So maybe Fairtrade will revise their standard this year, but then FSC might revise their standard in 4 years, and these processes take very long. So in terms of really capturing what happens in MSIs, it's quite tricky, and yeah, we're going to have to look at how we can do that with additional data. Yeah.
Thanks. I think I would like to invite the online audience once more, just in case there are still questions we haven't been able to address, or that's something that's on your mind. This is not the case, then I would like to thank our speakers today, Eva and Leona, for being out here with the product that's in the middle, where we're not, we're still kind of interpreting data, maybe collecting more, still kind of maybe fine-tuning what you're exactly going to find out. But the research seminars are for that kind of thing. They're not like just for finished stuff, but also for these kind of things in progress. So thank you very much. I would like to mention that we are organizing these research seminars regularly, although we do not have a very fixed date, like every Monday or something, every first Monday in a month. It's a bit more like also depending on the availability of our speakers, of course. But I think I can like semi-announce what we're planning, Simone. Is that okay with you?
Okay,
Simone Schiller-Merkens, who was speaking earlier, she's sitting next to me. We're preparing the next research seminar in December, in the middle of December, I guess, some time. And the topic would be how imaginaries of the future have responded to the pandemic. And I think it's maybe some kind of continuation of the topic. At least we're talking about people who are really taking a lot of initiative, showing a lot of initiative, trying to mobilize for sustainability, for kind of improving economic life and social life, of course, as well. And but you also have to face challenges. And so I invite everybody, also in the room, of course, and online, to watch out for our next announcements about our research seminar series, and hope to see you again at the next occasion. For now, good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us, and it's been a pleasure. And goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.